Hi everyone, this is Kathy from Homespun Seasonal Living, and this is another edition of our Cultivate and Nourish project. And today we have Susannah with us from healthygreensavvy.com, and we're going to talk all about elderberries. So thanks so much for joining us, Susannah.
I'm delighted to be here. I've been reading you for a very, very long time, so it's great fun to finally get a chance to chat.
I know it's a lot of people maybe know this or don't know this, but bloggers have this way of kind of circling around each other for a long time, but we don't always necessarily talk.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've been reading your blog for years now, so I'm great to be here.
So, and Susannah has a book that we're going to talk all about too later, all about elderberries and elderflowers, and it's really amazing. I had the opportunity to preview it. It's one of the perks of being a blogger is that you get to preview books. And I love books. I can never get enough of them, ever. Even with the internet, even though we can Google everything, I still love books. They're everywhere on every flat surface at all times at my house. I will tidy them up, especially if I know somebody's coming over. We'll tidy them up, but eventually every surface has.
Oh, that's great. Excellent. I'm glad to hear that.
Great. All right, so let's talk about, first let's talk about how to find elderberries and where do they grow. Even though I have international readers, let's talk if you know internationally where they grow, but let's definitely talk about where they grow in the United States, Canada, that kind of thing.
Absolutely. One of the most exciting things about elderberries is how incredibly easy they are to find. So they are actually pretty much all over the world, different subspecies. So the ones that you have probably tried in somebody else's elderberry syrup, if they haven't had fresh berries, those are coming from Europe. About 95% of the berries on the market right now are coming from Europe. Those are a species called nigra, Sambucus nigra. We have something different here in the US called Sambucus canadensis. And maybe out where you live, do you have the blue or the black elderberries, Kathy?
The people who cultivate them they're the black, but the wild are usually blue.
The wild ones are blue. Okay, so we don't have a climate for the blue ones. So out west, the blue elderberries are cerulean. So we have these three distinct varieties that are pretty common. They have them a different one in Australia and a different one in Asia. And native peoples all over the world, interestingly, have kind of put them to the same uses as herbal remedies of various sorts. So you need to know what species you have near you, the blue or the black. You always want to positively identify what you've got using, this is true of anything you forage, of course, using all of the identifying features, the bark, the growth habit, which is very different, I think, in the blue elderberry that perhaps grows near you versus the black one, right. The leaf pattern, as well as the berries and the flowers. So that's super important. We eat the black and the blue kind. There are two other kinds. In North America, you'll find the red elderberry, which is known as racemosa. Will not make you feel good if you bake it in a pie. Don't recommend eating that one. And in Europe, they have something called the dwarf elderberry, which had very, very powerful emetic properties. They make you vomit like crazy, and that was the medicinal use for them, going as far back as ancient Greece. So we avoid the red racemosa and the dwarf ebulis, and we stick with the black and the blue. So that's a really important thing to know. If you're not already a forager, if you're not already familiar with elderberries, it's wonderful to take a class or to go with someone who knows your berries or has them growing in their yard. Because once you see them and you can say, here's the leaf pattern, here are the berries, here are the flowers, got to look for this bark, that sort of thing, you won't make a mistake. But very novice people sometimes say, there's a lovely blackberry, maybe it's an elderberry, and it really isn't something you should eat. So you do need to be very careful with that. The other way to source your berries that I would really highly recommend after all of this research is growing your own. So recently, in the last 20 years or so, there's been a lot of research into improving on our native elderberries. So what you find wild can vary tremendously in how much it produces, how much flavor the berries have. So what I found when I was researching this book was that our native berries really didn't have a ton of flavor eaten on their own. I hear the blue ones are way better. I've never had them. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, probably. At least locally, we have very dry summers. And so the wild ones, if they're not getting watered, tend to not be very juicy.
Okay.
here anyway. So I think maybe like in Oregon, they're probably better where they get a lot more rainfall. But
right. When we get to travel again, I want to be one of those food tourists and head out west to try the blue elderberries after reading about them so much. It sounds like you have a much better plan. I can't grow them here even if I want to, but there are these varieties that have been chosen from the wild for better flavor and better yield. And so if you really want to use your berries fresh, you might want to think about planting some of your own. Once they're cut down, even the bland blackberries taste really good. What you're used to in an elderberry syrup, they have that signature flavor. But I made muffin after muffin trying to get these berries to taste like something, and I just couldn't do it. I would recommend growing them for that reason, and there are other really good reasons to have them in your own yard. I'm sure you've had to battle birds out in the wild who pick over, these wonderful clusters full of berries, and they've left, every fifth berry for you. And it's always really disappointing to find that. So you can keep an eye on your berries. You can share with the birds and then keep some of them covered up to keep the birds off. I find that window for foraging can close really fast, or you come and they're not ready, and then you're not ready to come back for a week and then they're gone. So there's that advantage. You also will get all of these pollinators coming for those elderflowers. Not everybody realizes how useful the flowers are as well as the berries. So if you plant these things, you get two crops. Which is an added bonus. They tolerate poor soils, they tolerate a certain amount of shade, they're a soil fumigant, they have all these virtues in the garden. So I highly recommend thinking of that. So the last way to source them, if you're not going to grow them, you don't have good foraging, is to buy them. And you normally buy them dried. There are a few growers now selling fresh or frozen berries, so that's also a possibility. But even working with some dried berries at $20 a pound, you're going to save if what you want to do is put up elderberry syrup, rather than buying these little $20 bottles of syrup, which you will go through very, very fast. So those are kind of your options for getting them.
Great. And for people who aren't foragers, or even, one of the other things I always suggest is often, at least everywhere I've ever lived, I lived back in Pennsylvania and now I live in Montana, but there's somebody has elderberries growing in their yard. They are probably forgotten, right? They're tucked back in some corner somewhere because they're probably forgotten. And it's kind of elderberry jelly when I was growing up was a thing, right? Before I really even knew about medicinal syrup, and I didn't really like it, I'll be honest. But like I felt like all the little old ladies made it, right? Right? All the kind of old world.
Right.
So somebody knows. So post about it, like on your Facebook page or whatever. Like, I'm looking for elderberries. Does anybody have any? And all you have to do is offer to make them some syrup in exchange for picking from their yard.
That's an excellent idea. And even in big cities, you can often find it. So the foraging in London is notoriously good, for instance.
Right.
So
definitely
don't give up on wild berries if you think there's some somewhere near you that you can get. Yeah.
Right. I'm a big fan, of course, of growing your own always when you can, if you have the space. But if you're like, do you want them now? One of the things I just where I live, I don't grow. Where my particular house is, I don't have a good climate for cherries. And so I always ask around because it's just like 30 miles away, they have a much better climate for it. So you just ask, and then you go and get it, right? So,
right. That's great.
So we talked about how to find them, and we talked a little bit about safety issues, but let's talk about, so we talked about the fact that we don't want to eat red ones and we don't want to eat dwarf ones, but what else? Because people have a lot of conceptions about elderberries being poisonous and whatever, so let's talk about those safe and not.
Right, absolutely. So the term poisonous is used in a lot of different ways. So some things poisonous, yes, it could kill you, but some things poisonous could also just make you feel really crummy. People use those terms without thinking about the ramifications. The elderberry plant is known to be very high in alkaloids, which will give you a bad stomach ache, and then also these compounds specific to elderberries called cyanogenic glycosides. Those are particularly concentrated in leaves, roots, and bark. But interestingly, this research coming out of the University of Missouri is finding that our native canadensis plants are in fact far lower than the Nigra ones.
Oh,
So a lot of the toxicity warnings apply less, probably, to the North American plants. I haven't seen that information about your blue ones, the Cerulean. But I actually exchanged some emails with a food scientist in England about the Nigra berries specifically, just because people do have this concern that eating one fresh berry might kill you. And that's not going to happen. So the amounts in the berries and the flowers are actually quite low, even in the Nigra ones. And then it may be very negligible in the American ones. So people who are very sensitive to elderberries, may have had a response before to something prepared with maybe a little too much seed in it from a European berry. They may do a lot better with a canadensis, but this is all still to be researched positively. So people don't have a definitive answer for this. But basically, to be on the safe side, you avoid the leaves and roots and bark. They've all been used medicinally for various reasons, but a lot of them is to make you vomit, and they will do. So there's one famous case of poisoning by elderberry juice where a group of people pressed whole branches of elderberries into a fresh, uncooked juice. And a bunch of them went to the hospital. Nobody died, but they drank cups and cups of this elderberry juice rich with leaves and branches of one of the Western kinds. So that gets a lot of play on the internet as they're toxic. Anyway, heat does help deactivate these things. So cooking helps, but just to be on the safe side, avoid the stems, avoid the branches, avoid the leaves. The leaves have external uses as well, but we don't really want to eat them. Even though I think probably our native plants are lower in some of the compounds that people are most worried about. Some people are also just overall more sensitive. Another place you'd want to be careful is that elderberry powders are sold. Those are often going to be whole, dried Nigra berries. And that means the seeds are going to get ground up and they haven't been heated enough to deactivate the compounds. That might make you feel really sick. A few people might even have allergies. There are also a few contraindications if someone is on an immunosuppressant, because elderberries are known to prompt the immune system into action. It's not something you would want to take. They're a diuretic, so if you're on diuretics, you'd want to think about that. Diabetes medication, they're a traditional remedy for diabetes. So these are things you'd want to talk to your doctor about before consuming regularly in large quantities, but a spoonful of elderberry jam probably won't do you in.
Right. So there's always up every day for medicinal. Yeah, definitely.
Right, exactly. So there's always this question of, trying to be cautious, but also not trying to worry. On the flip side, I also just want to say elderberries aren't a miracle cure, because they're sometimes touted as that. There are these fantastic studies going on. If you search in PubMed, you'll find thousands of studies looking in vitro, looking in animals, and some small human trials that really have shown how elderberry and elderflower to some extent are rich in these compounds that can block viruses from getting into your cells, that get your immune system firing. And in these small human studies, they found that it really does shorten the severity and duration of respiratory symptoms associated with colds and flu. So just take that all into account. I don't think elderberry will mean you'll never get another sniffle, but they are a great source of these fantastic plant compounds called anthocyanins that are fabulous for supporting overall health, reducing your disease risk. It's kind of the eating the rainbow concept. It's a really nice, dark, rich part of that rainbow that can do your body a lot of good in supporting your health.
Right. And just quickly, just as a follow-up to this, because she said it so greatly, Susannah said it so greatly, but even peanuts are poisonous to some people, right? Because they're allergic. So we need to remember to use that word carefully. So, some people might be sensitive to elderberries because they're allergic, or whatever. And then just like Western medicine, herbs are just like Western medicine. Not every pill works for every body, every person. So we all have to kind of figure out what works for us, right? And then again, too, because I have rheumatoid arthritis, and I can take elderberry, and it doesn't inflame my, my immunal response like it will for some people.
It's actually an arthritis remedy as well.
Right, but echinacea, which is also this great herbal remedy is really not good for me. It actually inflames my immune system too much. It makes it so it might help me get over my cold, but it's going to make my joints swell up. And so we just have to. We should always talk to a professional if we don't have any sort of education, and we just need to. I hate to say experiment, but we do kind of. I mean, doctors are sometimes just experimenting too, right? Like they're giving you a medicine that has had a lot of studies done about it, and they think it will work, and it may or it may not. And so we just have to try if you're not allergic.
Exactly.
And let's just talk really quickly, contraindications for pregnant women, lactating women.
Pretty much anything you look up haven't been studied on pregnant women and therefore are not recommended. So you're going to see that with pretty much every herb you look at. WebMD, no studies exist, so we don't know. And the bar we have for what constitutes incontrovertible scientific proof is too high for anything to meet. But one biochemist said, basically, this is so expensive and requires such large-scale human trial, it's never going to happen. Right. So the best knowledge we have is that for thousands of years, people have been using this in these ways because it works. So the idea of heating certain things or fermenting certain things in order to make them better for us, there's a reason for that. And this is from a university biochemist. That meant a lot to me to hear that. The other thing I would say about starting with a new herb, a little piece of wisdom from an herbalist I quite liked was just when you're starting, start with a quarter of the dose that's recommended, just to see that everything's okay, and build up gradually.
Great, perfect. All right, and so using fresh or dry, if we can't find it and we order them dry, can we use them in the same ways?
More or less. So I really got in the weeds here with some elderberry aficionados. And one of the bigger growers who's really out there promoting elderberry production in the United States told me that the dried berries are frozen first, and therefore all the juice runs out. He's a big proponent of using the fresh juice as much as possible. So a lot of us are only going to have access to the dried berries, and there are a lot of medicinal compounds we can extract from them through simmering. But are they identical to what we would have fresh? Probably not. I would think if what you're really after is absolutely maximizing everything you can get from these berries, I would choose the fresh. And if you're going to bake them in a muffin or something, you really want the fresh. I tried rehydrating dry, and it was just not a good thing. The person who contributed a tart recipe, an elderberry pie kind of recipe, she tried it with the dried berries and found that it worked okay for her. So again, you can experiment. The other thing with fresh versus dry, if you're using the flowers, fresh flowers are really going to make a very different syrup than the dry ones. And then I spent some time with a local distiller here who makes his own elderflower liqueur. He said the dried flowers for liqueur just horrible, and stay away from them. So to really get that sort of ephemeral fragrance from the flowers, you want to be working with fresh. The dry ones still make a lovely tea. You can put them in something like a muffin or a baked oatmeal, but the fresh ones, it's just sort of a fun seasonal thing to do, to toss them in. I tried freezing some, and that didn't work terribly well either, just to see if it would work. So if you have flavorful berries, the fresh ones would also be great in things like muffins or jam. The elderflower syrup you can preserve from the fresh flowers. That's gonna be useful in a lot of different ways. Herbally, the dried flowers and the fresh flowers are thought to work a little bit differently. Don't have that exact detail. It's in my book.
That's right. Hey, that's right.
So that's true of a lot of herbs, that the action changes when the flower is dried.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. All right, great. And then obviously flowers before berries, right? So berries are usually in the fall, late summer-ish.
Yes.
And I'm assuming probably everywhere in the world, but maybe not, right?
It really changes. I was actually just reading over at Hunter Engler Gather.
Oh yeah. I know who you mean, Hank. I know.
Yeah, he has a recipe for something called contact sauce in the book. Where he is in California, his berries start getting ready in May. Oh, wow. Which floored me. Yeah. So So normally for most of us foraging flowers, we're going to see those in early summer. Here it comes shortly after the solstice. I'm in zone 4. And then the berries follow maybe 6 to 8 weeks after, but it's amazing if the plant hasn't been pruned, you can find, so a friend's farm I go to forage on quite a lot, and she has this one plant that here in early September, it's still got a few flowers. Most of the berries are gone, but it's trying to flower. So you're gonna find all kinds of variation based on how much shade there is, and based on your climate, and based on what a plant feels like doing. And the berries will be ripening over a period of many, many, many weeks, but usually starting towards the end of summer and going into the early fall. Perfect. But the birds get them fast.
Which is true for cherries where I live, and elderberries too. And
yeah,
they don't seem to go. Of course, they don't go after the things I don't want as much. The choke cherries, of course, they're terrible. All right, so let's talk about preserving and stocking them in our apothecary, or I always say our medicine cabinet, or herbal medicine.
Okay. Very good. So you have basically 4 or 5 options on how you want to preserve them. So you can dry them. Drying the flowers, I talked to this one guy who grows 7,000 plants just for the flowers. He was an amazing source of information. He says, do not add heat when you are drying these flowers. Spread them out on a screen, maximize airflow, and leave them on the stem. We haven't talked about destemming, which is a real pain. It'll be much easier once they're dry. So dry your flowers that way, destem later, and do try to get out those little bits of stem. They're going to change the flavor of anything you make from them. They'll potentially add some stuff you don't want to consume. You can dry the berries as well. Those you're going to want to stick on a dehydrator, and they can take quite a while, depending on the berry, but the small ones might be as little as 4 hours, depends. You can steep them in a variety of different things. So you can make a tincture with alcohol. If you add sugar to it, you get to call it a liqueur. You can pop it in some vinegar, which you can use either medicinally or just in salad dressing because it's delicious. Elderflower vinegar was a staple in these historical cookbooks I went through. It's just, you wouldn't have an English kitchen without elderflower vinegar.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I know you've got a lot of glycerite recipes on your blog. Yep. So these are all going to extract slightly different compounds. So you can steep it in whichever one you choose. Some people use brandy instead of vodka. That's another option. Okay. You can freeze your berries. You can't freeze your flowers. It'll take up a lot of freezer space. There's a study that shows that some of the active compounds really degrade significantly after 3 months. So it wouldn't be something you want to do for long-term storage. You can make a syrup, obviously, with either one, the flowers or the berries, which you can then can. And I think you have a canning version with the fresh berries on your site. You can freeze some of the extra, but again, try to use it quickly enough. If you add enough extra sugar or some alcohol, you might also create something shelf stable. I tend to stay away from that myself. I don't like to have all the extra sugar if I'm trying to do something good for my body. And lastly, you could ferment. So you can make a wine or a mead, and elderberry wine has been a historical remedy for centuries. And the herbalist, Rosalie de la Forêt, who I interviewed for the book, she likes a warm elderberry wine. She was saying as a way to either keep colds at bay or just kind of warm herself up on a winter evening.
Not a bad thing at all. I don't enjoy the home brewing process. I'll be honest with everyone. I don't enjoy it, and so I don't. Yeah. And we're not big drinkers, and so we don't. Really, but I always think that would be really nice, and so I'm always kind of looking for somebody who's willing to trade it for anything else. But yeah,
right. That's great. I hear making a good elderberry wine is actually more challenging than people imagine. You have to have the right berries and the right condition. But anyway, I'm not a home fermenter either. So those are ones where I got contributions from people who really know what they're doing. So there is a recipe from somebody else how to make wine and an elderflower mead as well. It's actually a chokecherry elderflower mead recipe that's from Joybilee Farm.
Which could actually be really good, probably. Even, I mean, sure, I have had chokecherry wine, and it is really good. But the actual choke cherries themselves aren't good unless you put a lot. I mean, they're called choke cherries because they're very sour, and you don't want to eat the seeds because they will make you sick to your stomach.
Right. Absolutely.
Perfect. Okay, and let's talk really quickly about. I mean, I know your book is chock full, and so I want to send everyone to the book to get the actual recipes. We're not going to talk about that here. But let's talk quickly. We talked about syrup and we talked about wine and how to use these other things, but are there other medicinal preparations that we should consider for like our homes?
I really like using an oxymel, so that's the combination of the vinegar and the honey. It's not to everybody's liking, but the syrup, most of us who make the homemade syrups are meant to keep in the fridge. The shelf life isn't more than a couple months, but oxymel is vinegar and honey, it's going to keep for a very, very long time. And it's super easy to make. You don't need to turn on your stove. You're just throwing everything in a jar. I sometimes just take a little spoonful if I feel like I'm coming down with something instead of syrup, if I don't have syrup in the fridge. It also tastes to me like a really wonderful balsamic, and I sometimes just use it in place of that as a dressing. So medicinally, you could look to that. The standards are syrup and tincture. The one other thing I really like to do in place of the syrup, again, because of the sugar, is a decoction, which is essentially the syrup before you add a honey. Right. It's just an incredibly strong tea that you can make with dried berries. I've never tried it with the fresh because they were in short supply when I was doing this research. But you can either drink it straight by the spoonful, or you could dilute it in some hot water and you have a potent elderberry tea there. You can sip throughout the day if you feel like you're fighting something off. That's one I really like to use. And then of course there's tincture, but if you are taking it as frequently as people might suggest, you would be consuming a fair amount of alcohol. So if you're doing, though I did talk to one herbalist who really just uses a drop or two and finds that incredibly effective. So if you have your giant bucket of elderberries, I would consider popping some in vinegar, some in alcohol, some in your freezer, and putting up a batch of syrup. Right. And wine if you're really interested.
And I'm a big fan of that, and that's actually what I do in my own house, although I have not made elderberry oxymel, and I can't believe I haven't, but I haven't.
Really good.
I make a lot of sage oxymel because I really love the sage oxymel. It's one of my most favorite things for a sore throat is the sage oxymel. Honeysuckle glycerite is my other favorite, but I really like the sage oxymel, and I have a giant sage plant, and so I always have plenty. But I've never made the elderberry oxymel, and I might have to change that this year. But I almost always have tincture, and I almost have some elderberry syrup that I've canned. I don't usually dehydrate it just because I don't normally get. We only harvest enough for what we need, right? If we're foraging, right, we never take more than we need for our house, right? Our home. That's what I do. I'm not a commercial forager. So I only get enough for what I need. And so, 6 pints of syrup is more than enough for a household of 2 people and to share.
Absolutely.
We don't get sick a lot.
Right.
And like anything else, I'm a big believer that, it all starts with how you eat and how you live. So if we're eating healthy most of the time and we're moving our bodies and getting exercise, then we hopefully don't get sick. I mean, granted, we all get exposed. It's not that I don't ever get sick. I do. Mm-hmm. But yeah. So yeah, only harvest enough for what you need. But I haven't tried the sage or the elderberry oxymel, and that might be something I have to do. But I'm a big fan of having little things around because the tincture takes a little while, and so does an oxymel, whereas a syrup can be made in a
right. That's a very good point. Yeah, I wonder how the sage and the elderberry might mix together.
Yeah. That would actually be really good.
And at the same time, that could be kind of interesting.
Right.
I was amazed how well the flavor of elderberry paired with some other flavors that I really like. So I added it to a bunch of rhubarb recipes, and it's great with apples and peaches. And I just thought the flavors were really, really nicely blending with the elderflowers as well. So I just, for the heck of it, tried it with all my favorites, just like yours is sage. I really love hibiscus and spruce. So I was mixing those to see what was going to work, and I was really pleased with how nicely a lot of those complemented one another.
And so what she's saying, everyone, is feel free to experiment. I'm a big fan of that. When I teach classes or do anything, I'm a big fan in just encouraging people to play you know, experiment and see what you like and what you don't like. And granted, you know, if you're buying them then they're dry, you want to be a little more careful because they're expensive, and so you don't be wasteful. But you know, if you have the ability to pick, be creative, then do it.
Yeah. Also, I feel like depending on what your situation is, when you're fighting back against something like a cold virus, I like to kind of throw everything at it. So, you know, I'm a lover of spruce tea. So to throw in some elderberry at the same time, you know, it's just kind of a fun thing to do, and you're potentially amping up what is attacking the invader.
Right. No, I'm a big fan. So funny, because I'm really not much of a drinker, but it's going to sound like I am. I'm a big fan of a hot toddy when you don't feel well at night, because I mean, it helps me sleep anyway. And so a hot toddy, and I was thinking, you know, a hot toddy with a little bid of elderberry tincture in an elderberry tea with a good bit of honey, or even a dollop of the oxymel de vinegar might be. It would be really good, and you're getting a lot of stuff. Obviously, be careful, but
you're going to get it extracted in all those different ways. That's great.
Right. So always experiment and see what works for you. And it doesn't mean that you have to like patent it or that you have to tell anybody else about it, or you know, it's just what you're doing for yourself. You know, I always tell people, even in canning, as long as you can to the appropriate method, right? So as long as you're doing the right canning method, pressure canning with flow acid and whatever. So as long as you're doing it to the right method, go for it. You're fine, right? So just go for it. As long as you have the basics down, go for it. As long as you know what you harvested can be eaten.
Very important.
There you go. Right. Always start with the basics. And just really another quick note about foraging. We only take what we need, and we should never harvest from a plant that looks really stressed in any way. You know, you don't want to harm, especially wild plants.
Absolutely.
And be safe, because bears and other things. Don't worry about bears when you harvest berries out in the wild, right? Although they go after sweeter berries. I haven't ever really seen bears around other berries, but I'm sure it happens. But
we don't have that problem here, but
we like the huckleberries here, which are sweeter. Sweeter. So great. Well, is there anything else that we Ms. Sue, tell us about your book. Tell us all about your book.
Oh, okay, sure. I just was going to say a couple more things about how you would use the berries. So we were talking about how you would actually use all those preparations you made, because I think there's a fair amount of confusion there as well. And again, we have this big problem of lacking scientific data that we know no one can contest. But there's anecdotal evidence from tons of people who want to take a spoonful of elderberry syrup daily throughout the season as a preventative. So I don't have any information to say whether or not that actually works. What herbalists recommend, however, is very different, and that persuaded me because they're working with herbal wisdom from a very long time. And that, kind of like echinacea, you're going to want to focus on those early stages of infection. So where the research has tended to suggest elderberry is most effective is when you take it frequently after you feel a symptom. So if you feel that tickle in your throat that makes you think, oh my goodness, I'm coming down with something. If you read the bottles of the purchased stuff, sometimes it'll say 3 times daily. The herbalists I talked about doing it every hour. So having a spoonful of your strong decoction or a little tiny bit of tincture every hour to kind of keep the stuff circulating in your system. That was one suggestion. So also thinking about the fact that kids like the flavor of it, just remembering that their bodies are proportionately smaller, and you don't want to give them the same dose you're giving yourself if their body weight is a third of yours. You're going to be giving them roughly a third. And then what I'm hoping to promote in my book a little bit here is how much we can incorporate it into other foods. So the syrup, both elderflower syrup and elderberry syrup, potentially the elderflower syrup even more, is a really popular cocktail add-in. So again, we're not drinkers, but those of you who are, add it to your sangria or whatever your favorite mix of liquors are, and it adds this extra little special something. So I highly recommend that. You can make switchels or shrubs. You can add it to your herbal tea blend, so that not the dried berries, because they won't infuse properly if you just throw them in a steep of hot water. But the flowers, you know, mix them in with your hibiscus or whatever else you like to blend it with. Consider making gummies or crisps or jam. There are just so many other ways to use them, and the fact that they've all been sort of relegated to elderberry syrup is just a little bit sad. There are so many other things you can do with them. And so the book is in part a cookbook with a bunch of these recipes, some of which are mine, but a number of which are from people really expert in things that I don't do myself, including hard candies and pie. So you can check those out. And then I have a lot of detailed growing information and a great deal of history. I spent a long time with historical texts looking at the medicinal uses and also just how they show up in cookbooks over the 18th and 19th centuries.
Wonderful.
A lot of fun to research.
Yeah, I've been ruminating, so just so everyone can see my thought process on the blog. I've been ruminating on the value of vintage cookbooks a lot lately, mainly because I tend to pick them up at yard sales. And I found a really great one just recently, and I'm just so enamored with it. But I've been ruminating on the value of vintage cookbooks because we do get that historical knowledge that we are often missing when we pick up something that's brand new. And I'm not poo-pooing, obviously, I love modern scientific reports that help back up historical knowledge, but I love the historical knowledge. I love hearing about it and reading about it and just seeing how people did things for thousands and thousands of years in their homes before we had Google.
Right. It's really fascinating. They were called sort of housewife's guides in the 18th and 19th century, and it would include basic recipes for brewing wine from 15 or 20 different things, as well as how to make an ointment from elderflowers or how to make elderflower water. All of these different kind of home remedies that would have been a fundamental thing you'd want to know in your house. You look up the recipe and find out what you need to do to treat an eye infection or an ear infection or chest infection. It's really, really fascinating.
Right, because you couldn't run to the corner drugstore, right? So
right. And the doctor, would be a however long horse ride away. Yeah. Sure.
Or whatever, yeah, or more. Right. Yeah, exactly. Perfect. Great. All right. Is there anything else that we're missing that we should include? Everybody knows, as always, the links will be, down below. All the good stuff. We'll have all Susannah, so you can get Susannah's book and read about the recipes that she has on her blog, and we'll just get it all out there for you. But all the good information is in the book. You definitely want it. Okay. Is there anything else we're missing?
Not that that was a good kind of overview of some of the basics of using elderberries, but there's lots more.
There's tons more. We're really just glossing the surface. This would be 4 hours long if we tried to get into it. And even then, I feel like we'd still just be glossing the surface.
Right.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. It was great fun to talk to you today.